चलिए आज एक बहुत ही छोटे पर उतने ही गहरे दार्शनिक अंश को समझने की कोशिश करते हैं। ये उस एहसास के बारे में है जब किसी को गलत समझा जाता है, जब इरादे तो अच्छे हों पर नतीजा कुछ और ही निकल आए।
शुरुआत ही होती है इस लाइन से। लोग मुझे मूर्ख कहते हैं। मतलब कोई भूमिका नहीं, कुछ नहीं, सीधा मुद्दे पर। ये एक ऐसा आरोप है जो सुनते ही कहानी का पूरा संघर्ष हमारे सामने रख देता है।
तो अब सवाल उठता है क्यों? लेकिन क्यों का जवाब जानने से पहले हमें इस लेबल को ही समझना होगा। मतलब आखिर ये मूर्ख होता कौन है?
1 मिनट के लिए सोचिए, क्या हर मूर्ख एक जैसा होता है? जैसे ही हम ये शब्द सुनते हैं, दिमाग में एक खास तरह की छवि बनती है ना? पर क्या इसका मतलब हमेशा वही होता है जो हम सोचते हैं, या फिर इसके कुछ अलग पहलू भी हो सकते हैं?
और यहीं पर एक बहुत ही मजेदार कंसेप्ट सामने आता है, ज्ञानी मूर्ख का। ये साहित्य और इतिहास में एक बहुत पुराना किरदार है। सोचिए जरा, राजा के दरबार का वो विदूषक जो मजाक मजाक में वो सच बोल जाता था जो बड़े बड़े मंत्री भी कहने से डरते थे, जैसे बीरबल या तेनालीराम। तो ये कंसेप्ट हमारे स्पीकर की पहचान को एक बिल्कुल नया और ज्यादा जटिल एंगल दे देता है।
यहां पर यह फर्क बिल्कुल साफ हो जाता है। देखिए, एक तरफ है अज्ञानी मूर्ख, जिसे हम आमतौर पर समझते हैं, मतलब जिसे कुछ पता नहीं, जो बिना सोचे समझे बोलता है। और दूसरी तरफ है ये ज्ञानी मूर्ख, जो सच बोलने के लिए जानबूझकर मूर्ख कहलाने का खतरा मोल लेता है। तो फिर हमारा स्पीकर इन दोनों में से कौन है?
चलिए अब कहानी के दूसरे हिस्से पर चलते हैं। आखिर इस संघर्ष की, इस कॉन्फ्लिक्ट की जड़ क्या है? अच्छी बात यह है कि स्पीकर हमें खुद इसका कारण बताता है। और जवाब मिलता है इस लाइन में, क्योंकि मैं सबको उपदेश देने की कोशिश करता हूं। यहां पर ध्यान देने वाला शब्द है उपदेश। ये बस सलाह देना नहीं है, ये उपदेश देना है, और यही इस पूरी गुत्थी की चाबी है।
तो उपदेश देने का मतलब क्या होता है? देखिए, सलाह देना एक बात है, लेकिन उपदेश देना, इसमें अक्सर एक नेगेटिव सेंस जुड़ा होता है। ऐसा लगता है जैसे बोलने वाला खुद को सुनने वाले से ज्यादा बड़ा, ज्यादा ज्ञानी समझ रहा है। और बस यही बात लोगों को खल जाती है, उन्हें उबाऊ लगने लगती है।
लेकिन क्या उपदेश देने के पीछे हमेशा घमंड ही होता है? शायद नहीं। जरा सोचिए, हो सकता है इसके पीछे दूसरों की मदद करने की एक बहुत गहरी, सच्ची इच्छा हो। क्या पता स्पीकर को कोई ऐसा सच मिल गया हो जिसे वो दुनिया के साथ बांटना अपनी जिम्मेदारी समझता हो। शायद ये लोगों से गहरे लेवल पर जुड़ने का एक तरीका हो।
और यहीं से हम कहानी के सबसे जरूरी हिस्से पर पहुंचते हैं। एक तरफ स्पीकर का इरादा और दूसरी तरफ लोगों की धारणा। इन दोनों के बीच जो टकराव है, वही इस पूरी कहानी का दिल है। इस टेबल में यह टकराव बिल्कुल साफ साफ दिखता है। देखिए, स्पीकर का इरादा क्या है? ज्ञान देना, लोगों से जुड़ना, अपनी समझ साझा करना। लेकिन सामने वाले इसे कैसे देख रहे हैं कि यह तो अहंकारी है, आत्मप्रशंसक है, और आखिर में बस एक मूर्ख है। ये जो गैप है ना, इरादे और धारणा के बीच का, सारी समस्या यही है।
अरे ऐसे एक लाइन में कहना हो तो असली लड़ाई एक इंसान के अपने सच और समाज के उसे स्वीकार करने के तरीके के बीच की है। मतलब जब कोई अपना सच दुनिया के सामने रखता है तो कोई गारंटी नहीं कि दुनिया उसे वैसे ही समझेगी।
और ये सब हमें कहानी के आखिरी अनसुलझे हिस्से पर ले आता है। एक ऐसा चौराहा जहां स्पीकर और शायद हम सबको भी एक फैसला लेना है।
और आखिर में सवाल बस इतना सा रह जाता है, क्या करें? ये 3 शब्द सुनने में बहुत छोटे हैं, पर इनमें एक बहुत बड़ी दुविधा छिपी है। ऐसा लगता है जैसे स्पीकर एक चौराहे पर खड़ा है और उसे कोई रास्ता सूझ नहीं रहा। इस सवाल का कोई एक सीधा जवाब तो है नहीं, कई रास्ते हो सकते हैं। क्या उसे अपना संदेश ही बदल देना चाहिए ताकि लोग उसे पसंद करने लगे? या फिर क्या उसे ऐसे लोग ढूंढने चाहिए जो उसकी बात समझ सकें? हो सकता है बात कहने का तरीका बदलना पड़े। या एक और रास्ता है कि मूर्ख की इस उपाधि को गले लगा लो और अपना काम करते रहो। और ये पूरा विश्लेषण हमें इस आखिरी सोचने पर मजबूर कर देने वाले सवाल के साथ छोड़ जाता है। आखिर कोई सच इतना कीमती कब हो जाता है कि उसे बताने के लिए गलत समझे जाने की, मूर्ख कहलाने की कीमत भी चुकाई जा सके? ये एक ऐसा सवाल है जिसका जवाब शायद हर किसी को अपने लिए खुद ही खोजना होगा।
You know how a singularity in astrophysics uh, packs this, like, universe-bending gravity into a microscopic point?
Right, just this infinitely small speck in space.
Exactly. It's completely invisible to the naked eye, but it contains so much mass that it literally warps the fabric of reality around it. You look at the space bending around it and you realize you are staring at world-crushing weight packed into a microscopic footprint.
Oh, totally.
Well, today's deep dive is about the literary equivalent of a black hole. We are looking at a text that is exactly 14 words long, yet it contains, the blueprint for total existential collapse.
The brevity is what makes it so intense.
Yeah, so our mission today is to tear apart these 3 tiny sentences to understand a central, agonizing mystery. Like, how does a person's intense, burning desire to save the world ultimately end up destroying their own identity?
Well, the brevity of the source material is really what makes that destruction so palpable. I mean, some of the most profound human struggles are expressed in the fewest words. And that's often because the speaker has simply reached the absolute limit of their endurance. They are just, too exhausted to say more.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the text we are analyzing today is an excerpt from a piece titled "The Preacher of Fools," and it reads in its entirety. "People call me fool, since I try to preach everyone what to do."
And there's no question mark at the end, right?
Right, there is no question mark, just those 14 words.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a title, The Preacher of Fools, and a narrative that immediately drops us into a state of total paralysis.
Right into the deep end.
Exactly. Before we even get to the mechanics of how this speaker ended up frozen, asking what to do to an empty room, we have to look at the environment that froze them. The title itself sets up a massive ambiguity.
Yeah, the preacher of fools.
Right. Does this mean the preacher is themselves the chief fool? Or does it mean they are a completely rational person assigned to preach to a congregation of absolute fools?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the first line of the text actually provides the answer to how society views that dynamic.
Oh, how so?
It does so by completely stripping the speaker of all agency. People call me fool. Notice the passive construction imposed on the speaker there.
Oh.
They aren't declaring their own foolishness, They're reporting on the judgment of the collective. Society has already drawn a boundary line, placed the speaker on the outside, and handed them a diagnosis.
So the community has decided the preacher is the fool, not the congregation.
Exactly.
I want to challenge the nature of that diagnosis, though.
Okay.
Because being labeled a fool by the collective isn't always a straightforward assessment of someone's intelligence. Think about, like, the historical archetype of the court jester.
Oh, right.
The fool in a royal court was often the most perceptive person in the room. They were historically the only individual permitted to speak the unvarnished, dangerous truth to the king without being executed.
Though they had to cloak that truth in humor or riddles or erratic behavior.
Right, but they were the ultimate truth tellers.
Yeah.
So, is it possible that society is just using the label fool as a defense mechanism? Like, it's a way to avoid listening to a message that makes them deeply uncomfortable.
Oh, absolutely. The sociological mechanism behind that defense is rooted in cognitive dissonance. I mean, communities frequently pathologize what they do not wish to internalize.
Because it's easier.
Way easier. If a person, or preacher in this case, is pointing out glaring moral failings or demanding a level of ethical rigor that the average person finds exhausting, the community experiences psychological discomfort.
Right.
So the easiest, most efficient way to neutralize that threat without having to actually change any behavior is to delegitimize the source.
Wow, yeah.
If the crowd can reach a consensus that the speaker is just a rambling fool, the community is instantly absolved of the responsibility to reflect or repent.
It is infinitely easier to point your finger and laugh than it is to look in the mirror and change.
But the real tragedy woven into these first few words is that the speaker isn't fighting the label. Oh, true. They don't push back at all.
Right. A defiant truth teller would say something like, "People call me fool, but they are blind to their own ignorance." The speaker doesn't do that. They just state it as a heavy, undeniable fact. People call me fool.
It's so blunt.
The sheer bluntness of that statement carries the weight of 1,000 social rejections. It is the sound of someone who has fought against a cultural current for so long that they are finally letting the water drag them under.
They're beginning to internalize the mockery.
Exactly.
Which really begs the question of what exactly they are doing to trigger this relentless mockery. I mean, society doesn't just label someone a fool in a vacuum, The label is a reaction to a provocation.
Right.
The speaker is actively bringing this rejection upon themselves, and the second sentence reveals the mechanics of how they are doing it. Since I try to preach everyone, the word since establishes the causality.
They know exactly why they are being mocked.
Yeah. Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
The phrasing. Yeah. Push back on the word preach for a second. Or rather, the grammar around it.
The grammatical choices in that explanation are deeply unsettling. Look closely at the phrase, preach everyone. There is a missing preposition.
Right. In standard English, communication requires a bridge. You preach to a congregation. You speak with a friend.
The preposition acknowledges the distance between two distinct human beings. It respects the autonomy of the listener.
But by removing the word to, everyone just becomes the direct object of the verb.
Exactly.
It turns the people around them into raw materials, like you paint a canvas, you carve wood, you preach everyone.
That is such a vivid way to put it.
It makes the act of sharing their beliefs sound less like communication and more like an industrial process.
Right. It strips away the consent of the audience completely. They aren't offering a message for people to accept or decline. They are actively trying to process every single human being they encounter through the machinery of their ideology. And the sheer energetic cost of that metric is staggering. Just look at the word try, and since I try to preach everyone.
It implies an ongoing struggle.
An ongoing, repeated state of failure, really. They look out at the world, see a void, and feel personally, agonizingly obligated to fill it. But everyone is a mathematically impossible goal.
Yeah, for sure.
Even the most universally revered figures in human history had detractors. By setting their metric for success at everyone, the preacher has engineered a system where they are guaranteed to fail. Every single day. Forever.
Let's ground this in a modern analogy for a second. Think about the difference between sitting down in a quiet coffee shop to have a deep, mutual conversation with a friend about your core beliefs versus standing in the middle of a crowded subway station during rush hour with a blaring megaphone.
Oh, that's a perfect contrast.
Right. The coffee shop requires a preposition. You are talking to someone. You are reading their body language, adjusting your tone, and engaging in a feedback loop of empathy. But the megaphone is preaching everyone. It removes the individual humanity of the people rushing by to catch their trains. They aren't people anymore. They are just targets for the volume.
The megaphone analogy is highly revealing, but we want to complicate it just a bit.
Okay, how so?
Well, the megaphone isn't just an assault on the crowd. It is actually a psychological shield for the person holding it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if you use a megaphone, the sheer volume of your own voice drowns out the responses of the crowd. You don't have to listen to their objections, their nuances, or their individual realities.
Oh, wow.
So the refusal to use a preposition in preach everyone protects the preacher from the vulnerability of a real dialogue. It is a one-way street by design.
You know, consider your own digital life for a moment. Think about our social media feeds. How often are we as a society just preaching everyone?
Constantly.
Exactly. We broadcast our political opinions, our moral outrage, or our lifestyle choices into the void of the internet without a specific to attached. We are shouting into the digital subway station, demanding that everyone hear our truth.
And then we feel alienated when the response is either mockery or total silence.
Right. We are all, in a way, acting out the tragedy of this 14-word text on a daily basis.
And that lack of a filter, that refusal to calibrate the message to the audience, is precisely what cements their identity as a fool in the eyes of society.
So it's not the message itself.
The tragedy isn't necessarily the content of the message, no. The preacher might be holding the absolute secrets of the universe. They might possess the cure for all human suffering.
But because they refuse to acknowledge that not everyone in the subway station wants to be saved.
Exactly, or is even in a place to hear the message. Their methodology destroys the value of their truth. Their foolishness is their profound, unyielding lack of situational awareness.
Well, if the methodology is failing so spectacularly and is resulting in this painful social alienation, why don't they just put the megaphone down?
That's the logical question.
Why not suggest a coffee? If trying to preach everyone is the cause of the mockery, a rational person would change their strategy. But the text implies they just keep doing it. They are trapped in a loop.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, they are trapped by a psychological mechanism known as the sunk cost fallacy. And that's compounded by a desperate need for ego defense.
How so?
Imagine the preacher's journey. They have likely sacrificed relationships, social standing, and peace of mind to deliver this message. They have endured the laughter and the isolation.
Yeah, a lot of pain.
If they were to suddenly stop, if they put down the megaphone and admitted that their approach was flawed, they would have to face the devastating reality that all their past suffering was for nothing.
And if they stop, they validate society's label. They basically admit that they actually are the fool.
Exactly. To protect their ego from that crushing realization, they double down. It creates a horrific feedback loop of alienation.
So they act in a way that is socially uncalibrated.
By preaching everyone, society reacts by mocking them and labeling them a fool. The preacher feels the sting of that rejection, but instead of adjusting, they interpret the mockery as proof that the world is lost and needs their message even more.
So they preach harder.
The volume goes up, society mocks them louder, the cycle accelerates.
The gravity of that loop just collapses in on the speaker. You can feel the density of the situation pulling them apart. They are entirely defined by an action that is simultaneously destroying them.
It's incredibly heavy.
Which brings us to the absolute edge of the black hole. The singularity itself, the final sentence of the text, where the gravity finally crushes the star. What to do?
The transition from the second sentence to the third is structural whiplash.
Yeah, it really is.
We go from the relentless, active, burning compulsion of trying to preach everyone to a state of complete, agonizing paralysis. The kinetic energy of the text drops to absolute zero in 3 words.
Well, look at the punctuation, or rather, the total absence of it. What to do does not end with a question mark.
Right.
And if it had a question mark, it would change the entire emotional landscape of the poem. A question mark implies that a dialogue is still possible.
It leaves a door open.
Exactly. It implies an expectation of an answer, a lingering hope that there is a listener out there, maybe a reader, maybe a deity, maybe a friend, who might respond with a piece of advice. A question mark reaches out.
And the absence of the punctuation severs that reach. What to do without a question mark is not an inquiry. It is a declaration of systemic failure.
Wow.
It is the sound of absolute surrender. For the entirety of their narrative existence, this person's identity has been singular. The preacher. Their function has been singular, to preach everyone.
Yeah.
Now, in this unpunctuated void, they realize that their sheer willpower is no longer sufficient to overcome the friction of the world's indifference.
So what does this all mean? Instead of looking at this like a person asking for directions, let's look at it through the lens of a computer algorithm.
Okay, I like that.
Imagine an algorithm programmed with a single overriding core directive. Execute the command preach. It sends this command out to the network, but the environment society returns nothing but error codes. Mockery, rejection, isolation.
So the algorithm is stuck in an infinite loop.
Exactly, constantly executing a command that instantly fails. But it lacks any internal programming for error handling. It has no instructions for what to do when preach doesn't work.
Yeah.
Eventually, the memory overloads.
The system freezes.
Right. What to do isn't a question. It is the fatal error message flashing on a blue screen. The system has crashed.
And that crash represents a profound crisis of purpose, leading directly to ego death. Think about the authority inherently tied to the archetype of a preacher.
They're supposed to be the anchor.
Exactly. They are the ones standing at the pulpit, guiding the lost flock, possessing the moral compass, and pointing the way toward righteousness.
Right.
By uttering what to do to an empty room, the creature strips away all of their own authority. They are turning toward the void, completely unmoored, admitting that they are just as lost as the fools they were trying to save.
The vulnerability of that moment is breathtaking. It forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about identity. You are suspended in the amber of that final, unpunctuated thought.
Because if the preacher actually stops preaching, who are they?
Exactly. The title is The Preacher of Fools. It is not the person who used to preach. Their entire sense of self, their entire reason for drawing bread, is inextricably linked to the act of speaking to this unreceptive crowd.
If they silence themselves to escape the pain of being called a fool, they don't just lose an argument.
No, they lose their existence.
It is the ultimate psychological trap, and it is a universal human experience. I mean, this text isn't just about a religious zealot. It is about the moment of hitting the wall in any passionate endeavor.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
Anyone who has ever dedicated their life to a cause, an entrepreneurial vision, a fiercely held creative pursuit, or even a deeply unbalanced relationship, knows the ghost of this exact feeling.
You pour everything you have into it.
You pour every ounce of your spirit into an endeavor, you try to reach your version of everyone, and the world responds with hostility or cold indifference. You reach a point where forward motion is impossible because the resistance is too high.
But backward motion is a betrayal of your own soul.
Precisely.
And the author is brilliant here because they don't let us out of the trap. We don't get a neat resolution. We don't get to see if the preacher picks the megaphone back up the next morning and tries again.
Or if they drop it, walk away, and try to live a quiet, unremarkable life.
Right. We are trapped in the singularity with them, forced to occupy that deeply uncomfortable space of knowing that every available option leads to a form of dysfunction.
The ambiguity forces a mirror onto the reader. By refusing to resolve the preacher's dilemma, the text demands that we resolve our own. It asks us to examine the rigid structures of our own identities and the price we are willing to pay to maintain them.
Which brings us directly to you listening to this deep dive right now. We have just dissected a 14-word microcosm of existential dread. But the mechanics of this text are playing out in your life.
Almost certainly.
Have you ever been deeply, viscerally passionate about sharing something you knew was important, only to be met with blank stares? Maybe it was a revolutionary idea you pitched at work that your team instantly dismissed.
Or a piece of art you poured your soul into that nobody understood.
Exactly. Or maybe it was just a crucial piece of life advice you desperately tried to give to a loved one who absolutely refused to hear it. How do you balance that intense, burning urge to share your truth with the cold, hard reality of an unreceptive audience? Do you keep pushing until you break, or do you let the truth die inside you?
It is the most precarious tightrope walk of the human communicative experience. And as we leave you today, I want to offer a final paradox to mull over, building purely on the dilemma of this preacher, trapped in their tiny 14-word universe.
I'd love to hear it.
If the speaker chooses to stop preaching in order to avoid being pathologized and called a fool by society, they permanently lose their identity as the preacher. They become a shadow.
Right.
Ultimately, I ask you to consider, which is the greater foolishness, to continue speaking your truth to a completely deaf world, or to silence your own deeply held voice, just to fit into a society you don't even respect.
That is a staggering question to carry with you. That brings us right back to the beginning. 14 tiny words carrying the infinite crushing gravity of a black hole. It bends the mind around it. Thank you for stepping into the singularity with us on this deep dive. Take care of yourselves, and maybe, just for today, take a look at where you might be holding a megaphone when you should be offering a coffee.